Well, greetings, Lenten groups. I'm delighted to be with you and have a chance to talk about chapter 3 from Mike's book, which focuses on the Beatitudes. Now, as you know, we're in the Gospel of Matthew, but it would help us to have a little perspective, and for many of you, this is simply review. Uh, as many scholars claim, the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel that was written down, and Matthew relied heavily on that source, but he brought some of his own material as well, and the Beatitudes were a piece of that. It's believed that the Gospel of Matthew was written anonymously by a Jewish male in the last quarter of the first century. And there are those who identify Matthew's theme, and I love this, as higher righteousness. And when you understand that this Jewish male writer who often presented Jesus, as some scholars have been, as an observant Jew, but at the heart of Jesus' understanding of law is that central ethical teaching of love. And that's at the heart of what Mike would call the big picture. The writer of Matthew used the phrase kingdom of heaven some 32 times. Now, one scholar that I read noted that Jewish tradition dating in the way back, and I've read this before, preferred avoiding the word God as much as possible out of reverence for God. And so kingdom of heaven would be a way to accomplish that. Words matter, and you've read how seriously Mike takes words in his book. Now, prior to writing this particular gospel, this new church that had formed, this group of believers have had a lot to endure. They've lost the Apostle Paul, they've lost Peter to martyrs' deaths. The temple was destroyed by Rome. These are really tough, tumultuous times for the believers. The Beatitudes themselves are contained within the Sermon on the Mount, which is, as you may remember, chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew. And as Mike advises, it's good to pick up on the last few verses of chapter 4 so that we're reminded who is a part of this assembled crowd. They're people who have been afflicted by physical and spiritual challenges. Bible scholar Amy Jill Levine notes that the Sermon on the Mount could not possibly have been given in one setting, or as she puts it, the disciples' heads would have exploded with too much information. Levine instead proposes that the Sermon on the Mount is a collection of what she calls Jesus's greatest hits. And it's the writer's way of getting the readers ready for what follows. Like Mike, Levine notes that the Beatitudes are communitarian, that they are corporate, they are not privatized, they extend to the family of God, and the family is of great concern. Now, I liked very much how Mike helped us access these Beatitudes and how he promotes the two stanza solution. The first 4 Beatitudes are words of comfort, and the second 4 put forth resolutions towards which we aspire, like a New Year's resolution. So let's run through those real quickly. The poor in spirit are the beaten down. Mourning is seen as anguish. Meek is about showing restraint, or as Levine describes, foregoing one's privilege for the sake of the other. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness is what Mike calls the melding of right living with a concern for justice. Then comes the second stanza, where one practices mercy by tending, and I love that word, gently to the needy. That being pure in heart has to be both an inside spiritual challenge that results in an outward and visible act. That peacemakers are those whose aim is a just society that provides for all, or as Levine states, remembering that everybody is a child of God's. And then comes the last beatitude, tough words about persecution, that if you, like Jesus, care for all people, if you call out injustice, you will be persecuted. As I was reading this, an old story came to mind from my life, and it pertains to the Beatitudes. My first year of seminary, we were each required to take a course entitled Supervised Ministry, and it lasted the whole year, and as some called it, Supervised Misery. And in our small groups would receive assignments, and we were given a setting to spend time in every week. And there was another woman and I in my group who were assigned a high rise for the elderly in the neighborhood served by Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. Now, once a week, my partner and I would go there, and we would conduct a worship service prayer meeting in their common room. And usually we had about 15 to 20 women attend. It was really fun. They each brought their own hymnals, and they were all different. And I'm telling you, this group sang and prayed their hearts out. On top of that, once a week, I would go down and call on Miss Harris. The director had asked me specifically to spend time with her because she was reclusive and she never left her apartment. They couldn't get her involved in anything in the building. So every week that year, I would go and I would knock on Miss Harris's door, and she'd let me in. She was always dressed completely in black. She would take me into her tidy living room and we would talk. I slowly learned that the crayon pictures that were on the wall behind my head had not been drawn by grandchildren. Miss Harris had no family. She had drawn each one of those, and in fact, she had a neatly stacked pile of additional drawings readily available to switch out. The doll sitting in the corner chair did not belong to a child. It was Miss Harris's doll. As she explained to me, that doll was the only person she could talk to that kept her from being so lonely all the time. As to why she didn't leave the apartment, Miss Harris explained to me it was because of demons, and that demons are so wily that they could climb through your keyhole or underneath your door, and they would steal all your possessions if you left. And so she didn't. And instead, I would come and sit with her week after week. Just before spring break, with her permission, I brought a friend of mine from my media and ministry class and asked if we could interview her on tape. It was a class project that wouldn't be shared beyond our class, just our little group of 10 in the supervised ministry. And in those days, I have to add, to videotape anyone involved hauling a lot of heavy equipment and lights. And we set everything up, which took a while. And then I interviewed Miss Harris. Well, the next morning, I left for spring break. I was going to be gone 10 days. I left with the choir on a spring break East Coast singing tour. We sang in churches. And when I returned to school, I went back to see Miss Harris on that Monday. As I came into the building, and I could still see this, the director came running up to me and said, "I've never seen anything like this. It's Miss Harris. I don't know what happened, but we can't get her out of the hall. She's going to everything." He said, "It's just amazing. I've never seen such a change." In fact, he used the word, he said, "It's a miracle." Well, I couldn't wait to see her. I took the elevator up, and when I knocked on her apartment door, there was no answer. And then I heard her voice from down the hall, and I followed it, and I found her surrounded by a group of women. She was holding court. She was talking. She was laughing. And when she saw me, she stood up. We went back to her apartment, sat down to talk, and eventually I asked her what had happened. And she told me that the night we had been there with our equipment was the night she had had her lucky dream. She'd only had it one other time, and it was God's way of telling her that she didn't need to be afraid to leave her apartment. It would be okay. My word for that is mystery. I don't understand how mystery works, but I know that somehow an opening was created inside Miss Harris that allowed her to receive the Spirit's reminder that she need not be afraid. And I don't believe I get any credit for this moment, and I mean that. I was calling on her because of school assignments. And here's my further confession. That when I left town, I sent her a letter or two and received one from her. But when I returned to school in Atlanta, it didn't even occur to me to call on Miss Harris the remainder of my seminary time. I'm going to tell you, I'm embarrassed by that. It's a testimony to my youth at the time and my self-absorption in school and work. I should have had a lifelong relationship with the elderly Miss Harris. So, I've added her to my list of people to look up in eternity. I owe her an apology, a hug, and a long conversation. And Jesus was so right. Blessed was Miss Harris's spirit, for God's kingdom was meant to be hers. Amen.